Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I want to welcome everybody today to the Revolutionize Your Retirement interviews with experts to help you create a fulfilling second half of life. I'm Dorian Mintzer. I'm your host. Without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful guest. I want to just tell you, I met Vic in Sarasota at the Positive Aging Conference last December. He was one of the keynote speakers, and I have to say he is a fabulous speaker, and I have just been very turned on to this book, which I have used as gifts now for many people, including my son, who's a teenager. And as I mentioned before, it's called On Purpose, Lessons in Life and Health from the Frog, the Dung Beetle, and Julia. And I know it has a very peculiar title that Vic will be telling us about. But let me just tell you a little about Vic. I know some of you had read a little about him when you signed up, but Vic received his Ph.D. in Health Behavior and Health Education at the University of Michigan School of Public Health in 1983. And since 1995, he's been professor in the University of Michigan School of Public Health, and until 2009 was director of cancer prevention and control at the University of Michigan Comprehensive Cancer Center. He founded the University of Michigan Center for Health Communications Research, which is a collaborative research-focused organization of health and behavioral scientists, educators, software engineers, and artists. Through this center, he's been a leading investigator on over 45 million in grant-funded studies, computer-based interactive communication for health-related behavioral change and decision-making. Currently, as Director for Innovation and Social Entrepreneurship, he's been working in the University of Michigan School of Public Health and the University of Michigan to create an environment that promotes more direct dissemination of research efforts to improve the public's health nationally and globally. And he's also visiting professor at the Peking University School of Public Health. His latest research and book is related to the importance of developing and maintaining a strong purpose in life. The book, as I mentioned, On Purpose, Lessons in Life and Health from the Frog, the Dung Beetle, and Julia, is written for the lay public with a professional comic illustrator as a graphic novel, and it's accompanied by a free website, smartphone, and web pages. And Vic also has a regular blog on the Huffington Post related to purpose and meaning in life. And today, he's going to help us consider purpose really in terms of the second half of life, retirement years. So, Vic, I want to turn it over to you, but to comment just before we start that one of the things that I truly love about your book is that you combine it with and background, and a lot of books don't do that. So I'd like to ask you, I want to start, if you don't mind, with the question of what led you to focus on purpose in life, and maybe that's the stage for us of what led to this interest, and then we'll get into some other questions and issues about purpose and meaning. So welcome.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this story, and thank you, everybody who is on this call, for listening in. Truly appreciate it. I think that the easiest answer to why I started developing this book related to purpose is that I personally had lost my own purpose for a while. A little more than 4 years ago, on March 2nd of 2010, I lost my 19-year-old daughter, Julia. She was one of the first children to get a heart transplant when she was young in 1990. She was born healthy, and then she caught a chickenpox virus, which most of us get. And this virus attacked her heart, which most of us don't. That happened too, luckily. And the chickenpox virus dilated her heart and caused this cardiomyopathy. If you are a golfer, by the way, and happen to be watching the U.S. Open this year, one of the golfers who finished second, Eric Compton, is a double heart transplant recipient, and he had the exact same thing. He really induced cardiomyopathy that attacked his heart, and he's on his second heart transplant, but did very well. And Julia actually did very well early on, and she needed a second heart transplant when she was 9. Many people do end up needing another heart after their first heart transplant. And then when she was 19, she very suddenly and unexpectedly passed away. And at that time, I went through a grieving process that one might expect and was fairly despondent. I was in northern Michigan, and one morning I decided to take my kayak out into a very calm Lake Michigan. We have a place right on Lake Michigan. And I took my kayak out about, close to a mile out. It was quite a ways out. And I just watched the sun come up early in the morning. It was 5:30 in the morning. And I felt my daughter Julia in me very deeply. This is just 3 months after she had passed away. And I felt her voice in me saying, you need to get over this. And it wasn't just you need to get over it, but you needed to rise above yourself. You needed to get over your own ego. And I felt her very strongly in this. And I started realizing that if I had continued on the path that I was, that I'd probably just die of an early death by killing myself, but I wasn't suicidal, maybe by drinking myself to death or just becoming so despondent that I wasn't going to move forward. And it turned out that was Father's Day. And I didn't know that until I kayaked back in, and I realized it was Father's Day. I was by myself in this cabin that we have. And I started thinking more about this and realized that I really did need to do something about myself. I also had this realization that I'm a behavioral scientist and I help other people make changes in their lives. And I thought, my goodness, I really should study myself. And in studying myself, what I realized is beyond and above the grief that I felt, I realized that I'd really lost my purpose in my life. Purpose was directed towards my daughter Julia and helping her live a big life. Regardless of how long she lived, we had no idea, have died at any time. We knew that we were dedicated, my wife and I were dedicated to giving her a big life. And so we have been around the world a few times. We've gone to Thailand for cooking lessons. We've gone to Sydney, Australia to meet with koala bears. We've been to London a couple of times. So whenever I had a business trip, I would take Julia along, and we had a really great life, and she had a wonderful life. But I realized that was my purpose, to give her a big life. And when she had passed, I'd lost. And so I started studying this and reading more about it. And I read everyone from St. Francis of Assisi's work, where he would talk about purpose in life and the importance of having purpose, to Viktor Frankl, Viktor Frankl had gone through 3 concentration camps, and he was a psychotherapist, but he was sent to 3 different concentration camps where he saw about 90% of the people around him die. And what he realized is that people who lost meaning and purpose in their lives, that was the precursor to them getting sick and dying. And he realized that purpose and meaning were fundamental. Having purpose in life was fundamental to living a life. And while people suffered so much through these concentration camps, he also discovered that people might be working early in the morning to watch the sunrise and go, wow, what a beautiful sunrise. And he was stunned by the fact that some people could still, in a concentration camp where everybody was starving to death and dying and being gassed around him, they would still find something of beauty. And so I read this book, Man's Search for Meaning, and I realized I should start studying this, because Viktor Frankl didn't have the research to back him up when he said purpose in life is fundamental to living a big life, to living a healthy life, to changing your life. And now, turns out, there's a lot of science to this philosophy. So the philosophy that one might learn that's 2,000 years old, or from St. Francis of Assisi, and then lived through in the journey of Viktor Frankl, I thought maybe a book should be written about this, but a more modern book that had modern science in it. And it turns out there's a lot of science to purpose in life. So that was just a little background of why I decided to get into it. Is a very personal reason for getting into that.
Certainly was, and I appreciate so much that you shared that. And also how, in a sense, what I hear, which is so beautiful, is partly your connection with Julia helped you step back and say, I've got to do something different, and I need to figure out how to live my life and what's going to give me purpose now that she's not here. But also thinking about the skills that you had and to integrate it. Also just impressed that we have the 2 Victors here, you and Viktor Frankl. as well as all of the other.
I would put myself up at Victor Frankl's caliber, who is really one of the patron saints, I think, resilience, of healing. The person who I really regard as one of my heroes in my life. An amazing person. I wish I had met him.
Yeah. You've mentioned the science underlying it. Maybe you can move into that because, as I said at the beginning, part of what I love about your book is how you integrate that. And also, for those of you who haven't read the book, it's a graphic novel, and at the end of it, chapter by chapter, Vic has discussions and resources, and it sounds to me like you read just so extensively in this research. So if you can share with us some of what you've been learning so that we can glean from the wealth of your knowledge.
Oh, thank you, Dory. I did. This book took 3.5 years to write, actually. And I started at that point in time that I came off the lake. I literally did start thinking about this book and writing it. And I started reading. And I read a combination of things. One was philosophy, and much of that was existential philosophy, which was deeply influential to Viktor Frankl. I also read ancient philosophy, from Stoic philosophy, from Seneca, Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius, by the way, would wake up every morning and assume that he would die. And you might think, what? He assumed he would die. He literally would, and he talked about this in his book Meditations, which is a wonderful book, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And in assuming he would die that day, he lived a much bigger, and other Stoic philosophers would do things such as, when you kiss your child at night, assume that your child will never wake up. And while that sounds so morbid and to some extent in our modern culture horrible, what they did then was become better fathers or better mothers, because they realized that everybody is temporary on this earth. My own daughter had a temporary life on this earth. So do I. And my daughter taught me that. So that was important. But it turns out now that there's a science behind this. I'll give you just one example of the science. It turns out in a randomized trial, when they asked students to write down what would be on their own headstone, they gave them what we would call greater mortality salience. So they start thinking more about their deaths. And the students at first went, ew, I don't want to write down what will be on my headstone or what would be set up on memorial service. What they ended up doing is valuing their lives more than the control condition that just wrote about current events. And in valuing their life more, they lived their life bigger. And so they had a stronger, more purposeful life. They actually started developing more purpose in their life. It turns out that people who have a purpose in life, and there are a number of studies that have been done among seniors that are very relevant here. Seniors who have a purpose in life, there's a study at the university, out of the University of Chicago's Running Alzheimer's Center by a woman named Patricia Boyle. What she did was take seniors in senior centers, and she asked them about how purposeful their life was, and whether they had a life that was strong in purpose, or whether they're wandering around aimlessly now that they were retired. And then she followed people, first doing MRIs, putting people into magnetic resonance imaging machines, these big tubular machines that you put into, and she scanned their brains, and she found that the people who had a strong purpose in life, over time, had stronger brains. Basically, their brain connections were much stronger than people who had a weak purpose in life. Their brains started deteriorating faster. 7 years later, she found that people with a weak purpose in life or no purpose in life were 2.4 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease than people who had a strong purpose in their life. Now that's fascinating, because at baseline, at the time they initially asked about purpose, all of these people were cognitively functional. They were fine. There's no difference. And then suddenly, 7 years later, there's a 2.4 times difference. And I started thinking about this and then reading more. And it turns out that people who have had heart problems initially, who have a strong purpose in life, are 30% less likely to develop a heart attack than people with a weak purpose. People with a strong purpose who are seniors sleep far better. 4 years later, are less likely to develop sleep problems. 7% less likely to develop sleep problems 4 years later. Far less likely to gain weight. Over 80% less likely to gain weight. They are less likely to develop depression. And they're far more likely to have things such as good sex. They're more likely to be happy. They're more likely to be resilient to life stressors or illness. And I started thinking, my goodness, I had no idea about this. What if there was a drug like this? If there's a drug, can you imagine if there's a drug that improved your Alzheimer's risk by 2.4 times? Can you imagine? That would be in our drinking water. It would be a multi-billion-dollar drug. And if it were a drug, it'd probably contribute to just a fraction of that amount of action. So here's something that's free, that has no side effects. The only side effect might be that you have more friends because you're thinking about things bigger than yourself. Wouldn't be too bad. And it's just something that we can obtain. We can all obtain a stronger purpose in our life. I just thought, gosh, there is actually a science to this philosophy. And that's when I thought that a book would be written about this. Viktor Frankl wrote a book over 60 years ago about this stuff. What would Viktor Frankl write now? And I thought he might write this book a little bit differently. He might write it as a graphic novel. He might write it more as this story that has pictures. He also developed a therapy called logotherapy or meaning therapy. But this involved going to see him, the psychotherapist, once a week for decades. And it would cost a lot, obviously, and not many people could see Viktor Frankl. So what would he do now? He might build an app on your iPhone or iPad or on the web that actually helps you identify your purpose and monitor how closely you live your life every day to your purpose. And so that's what I've done as well. It accompanies the book.
My response, of course, is like this, wow, with all of the things you're saying. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of it? I just find the research that you're telling us about amazing, and it makes so much sense. And just even thinking about, I think for any of us, thinking about that we don't live forever just helps you be more present and be in the moment. But I'm struggling now trying to decide, do I want you to tell more about the science or a part of what I so love too is how you bring the science to life with the frog and the dung beetle. Maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit now, and then we can move on.
Yeah, in this book, first of all, I'll give you just a little background, and this is between you and I and the people listening. But originally, I wasn't going to write this as a story about my daughter. As I was learning more about purpose, I thought, wow, maybe I should write a journal article about purpose in life, like a review, because nobody had really developed a review of purpose in life that kind of collect all of these data. And then I realized that 6 people would read that scientific journal article. And then I thought maybe I should write a book about it to the general public. And I actually then started a book as a self-help book, thinking about this as a scientist. And I started writing the typical scientific self-help book, which usually starts with, I'm a Ph.D. or M.D., or you put in your label, your title. And here's a lot of advice. And usually advice in bullet points, your parts of chapters. And then there's always a patient or two that's in there. Meet Mary and see what she did. And I realized at that point, as I started writing this self-help book, and I'd written the first couple of chapters, that I didn't like self-help books that much, or most of them. And I didn't want this formulaic approach. And so I met with a friend of mine who's a Hollywood Screenwriter Guild writer who lives in Los Angeles. And I invited him up to northern Michigan, up to the lake. And I said, Monty, what would you do? And we spent literally a week working through this. And finally he said, Vic, you have to include your daughter in this book. This is a journey that you went through. And the most authentic way to convey this as a journey the way Viktor Frankl did. Viktor Frankl took his own journey and experiences through these concentration camps and then put in the science of it and put in the philosophy and kind of intertwined all of those 3 areas, his own personal journey, the science, and the philosophy, into a book that has reached literally tens of millions of people. And so I thought I would do that and try to build that. And then he said, okay, if you write it as a journey, if you're familiar with Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, this is the classic approach to writing a journey story. You need to have a sage or an oracle. And my friend Monty reminded me that in Star Wars, the oracle or sage in that was Yoda, who was this kind of shriveled up little ugly creature. And yet he turned out into a very lovable creature. And I started searching for a Yoda in my journey. And I happened to be in London at the time. I was doing some research with some colleagues in London. And I went to the British Museum. Every time I go to London, I go to the British Museum. I'd recommend it to any listener that they go to the VM or the British Museum. And they have the world's largest exhibit ancient Egyptian artifacts, mainly because they stole most of them from Egypt, and they have them now. And all through these Egyptian artifacts, there was this scarab god. And the scarab god was pushing the sun in every morning. And I learned more about the scarab god. His name was Khepri, and he is the most important god in ancient Egypt. And this scarab god would push the sun up every morning, and he was in charge. He was representative of rebirth and transformation and transcendence, thinking about things bigger than himself and pushing the sun up to to basically become reborn every day. He would come out of darkness, which the ancient Egyptians called chaos, which made perfect sense, to become reborn with this new sun. And I thought, my goodness, this is so relevant. And I found out that the model for Khepri, this scarab god, was, believe it or not, the dung beetle. And can you imagine the Egyptians in the desert, they're watching this dung beetle crawl along the desert floor, pushing the dung ball with poop in a totally straight line. By the way, dung beetles use the Milky Way. This has just been discovered last year. Use the Milky Way to navigate the direction they take in rolling their dung ball. By the way, that's the only known insect that follows the stars in the direction. So anyway, they follow the stars in pushing this dung ball. And I thought, my goodness, this is my character, Winston the dung beetle. So I created this dung beetle as the character. And in part 2, there was something I liked about a dung beetle, and that they are literally born into a giant ball. But the dung beetle, after they've rolled their ball, with their female dung beetle counterpart, they bury the ball and they make mad, passionate dung beetle love. And the female dung beetle lays her eggs inside the dung ball, and the larvae eat through the dung ball, which is their nutrients to grow. And I thought, so many of us are born into poop, in many ways, or we have poop happen to us. I won't use the F word. That's the idea. Things happen to us. I thought this is representative of what happens to a lot of people's lives. And I didn't want this book to be for the people at the top of the pyramid necessarily. I wanted this to be for everybody, whether they are born into poop, whether they've had bad things happen to them, or whether they're thinking in a very self-transcending way that's bigger than themselves. I wanted to encourage that kind of thinking regardless of who you.
And I think you really accomplished that, which is, I think, so
thank you.
Phenomenal. Because it leads to what is purpose. Is it the big P or the little P, or what's good purpose or what's bad purpose, or what is it?
And the frog comes from a couple of things. Friedrich Nietzsche, who actually was he developed the prototype philosopher for existential philosophy. He was very concerned that as we lost our religion, as we lost our meaning through religion, he predicted that, and of course he was an atheist himself, but beyond being an atheist, he was very concerned that as we lost religion, that we would start losing meaning and purpose in our lives. And so he wrote about the Uberman, or the Superman, needing to create their own purpose in their life. And that was, by the way, very meaningful to Victor. He quoted Nietzsche all the time. And Nietzsche also had this phrase, he called it the frog perspective. He said, most of us have a frog perspective, meaning we see the world from the frog just sitting down in the jungle, everything around them, and they think they know everything, and yet there's this entire world around them that they can't see. And he called that the frog perspective. The other reason I use this is I start the second chapter of this book with a frog in boiling water. And there's a metaphor that most of you probably know about, where if you put a frog in boiling water, a live frog, and just drop them into boiling water, of course they're just going to jump out right away. If you put a frog in cool water and you just gradually increase the heat, the frog boils to death. And I think that's so relevant to so many of our problems that we have our waistline that starts ever expanding, but we don't notice it. Or our sedentary behavior, or as we watch more and more TV, as we drink a little bit more all the time. Every year we just drink a little more alcohol at night. And then suddenly that 5 o'clock alcohol hour moves to 4 o'clock. That's a boiling frog problem. Climate change, one might argue, is a boiling frog problem. We don't notice it until suddenly we fall asleep and we're And I thought so many of the health problems that I deal with in my profession that I've helped people make changes in are boiling frog problems that we fail to notice until it's too late. Cigarette smokers who keep smoking and they don't notice any problems until suddenly they have emphysema or suddenly they have some major problem like lung cancer that they can't control anymore. Those are boiling frog problems. So I wanted to introduce this frog for a number of reasons. And the frog is us in this book. I'm a frog in boiling water. We are all frogs in boiling water. The question is, how do we get that frog to jump out? And you can tell the frog, look, the water is boiling. If you don't jump out, you'll die. And we're all used to it, and it doesn't help us. But what seems to help is if you have some sort of transcending purpose in your life. It turns out that people who have a transcending purpose or meaning in their life are less defensive, and they're more willing to listen to people or listen to information saying, you know what? We need to change our lives.
So what's your sense on how people develop this transcending purpose?
Yeah, that's such a great question. A lot of people ask me, okay, you convinced me I need a purpose in my life, but you know what? I don't have one. Or if you were my age, Vic, you would know that it's not so easy to have a transcending purpose. And I understand that. I'm 58 years old and I'm not 78 years old. And I know my body will be different when I'm 78. I know I'm going to be more tired, in fact, more exhausted. My body also already has, so it's started to get more creaky and painful. And I can imagine when I'm 78, I'm going to have a lot more of those things. And then to be able to tell people who are older, you need a purpose, isn't that a little bit cheeky of me to be doing when I'm employed as a professor and I'm doing a lot of things, a lot of research? It's very easy for me to have a purpose, frankly. And many people who are 78 now or 68 or whatever are retired had big purposes, and then suddenly they lose those. One thing that I found is that many people who are elderly develop a new purpose. They repurpose their lives. And by repurposing or by having a purpose, what I mean is to have a purpose that's bigger than yourself, something that is transcending yourself, thinking about things that are more than you. So a purpose could mean having a better golf score, getting forward par or great golfing, shooting your A, or something like that. Understand, that's a purpose. But it's not necessarily a transcending purpose. The transcending purpose would maybe be, you know what, I have some grandchildren right now, and I want to help mentor those grandchildren. I want to be a better mentor to them and do what I can. Or there are a couple of seniors here who really could use some help, who don't have anybody around them. I could be helpful to them in that last chapter that they have of their life. Other people say, I am quilt. My mother, by the way, who's 82 years old, creates quilts, and she gives these quilts away. That's a transcending purpose. And my father, documenting both of our family's histories dating back generations. And I think that's a transcending purpose. He's thinking about purposes that are bigger than himself. So one can repurpose their lives and have this new purpose or set of purposes, I think. And when people ask me, how do you do that? What I suggest to people that they start with their core values. What are the things that you care about most? And at this point, I'd like to suggest to people, if they have the internet, that they consider going to www. They don't have to do this right now, but maybe they can write it down. If you have a pencil, or if you're in front of a computer, you could go to www.Dung Beetle. That's DUNGBEETLE.org, O-R-G. So that's www.dungbeetle.org. You will get the background of my book, and you'll also be able to sign up for an app. And this app is a program that helps you identify a purpose in your life. And the first part of that app is thinking about what your core values are. And we have 15 different core values that are there, such as community, my relationships, being independent, being creative. There are 15 different core values, and you get a chance to identify which 5 core values are most important to you. And then you're able to actually indicate how strongly held, how deeply held each of those core values are, and to just write maybe a sentence or two about why those are such important core values to you. So that's one step, Dory. Step 2 for me is, and you can again do this on the app if you choose to. Not everybody chooses to do this, but you can literally think more about your own death. I know that doesn't sound quite right to many people. Why should I be thinking about my own death? It's the last thing I want to think about. Are you familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross? She wrote a famous book on death and dying. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I'll just quote this because it's in the 5th chapter of my book. She said, if all of us would make an all-out effort to contemplate our own death, to deal with our anxieties surrounding the concept of our death, and to help others familiarize themselves with these thoughts, perhaps there could be less destructiveness around us. So you're actually able to meet the Grim Reaper in a comic character. And the Grim Reaper asks you, what would you like to have on your headstone? What is your epitaph? And what we find, by the way, is about a quarter of the people, 1/4 of the people who take the app decide to do this. And those people who still have this epitaph end up being psychologically, it turns out that they end up being psychologically healthier than the people who do not do that. And so it also, as I said before, it's the Stoic philosophers thinking a bit more about your death. Actually, as you start thinking about the finite number of years you have, and that you need to do something in those finite number of years that you're on this planet. And that helps you, motivates a purpose in your life.
I think what you're saying makes so much sense. I know I actually have clients of mine do this exercise because it really does make a difference. If you let yourself think ahead and think about what would happen if you were at your deathbed, what would be the regret? And then you have a chance to think back, or there are different ways to phrase the question. But George Kinder, who is a financial planner, has 3 questions. And the last one, which I think also gets at what you're saying, is after, if you had no problem and there was money, or if you had 5 to 10 years to live and didn't know when you were going to die, but you'd be healthy, what would you change? What would you do? And the final question is, you're told you're going to die in 24 hours. What do you wish you had done? What do you wish you had said? Which really puts it in higher relief to say, this is our one life to deal with in whatever way we can, and why not make the best of it? Which is, I think, so much of what you're talking about. Yeah.
I was the associate director of our University of Michigan's Comprehensive Cancer Center for 15 years. Literally hundreds of cancer patients and survivors. And I very rarely met a cancer patient who didn't in some way change their life. I think being broken open like that changes you, and it gets you thinking about things bigger than yourself. And I also very rarely met people who were just simply afraid of dying. Of course, you meet people who are afraid of dying, and that makes sense. But what they seem to be more afraid of or upset at is that they weren't able to fulfill the things in their life that they wanted to. And when they found out, when they got a cancer diagnosis, or a terminal cancer diagnosis, they'd very often go, boy, I wish I had done this, or I wish I had done that. Why didn't they do that before they got cancer? In part, that's what this book is about. Maybe before you get sick, maybe you can start thinking about a purposeful life and not wait until you do get sick. There's one final part that I'd like to mention about how to find a purpose. In my book, the person who wrote the foreword of my book is named Dean Ornish. And Dean Ornish was President Bill Clinton's personal physician. He helped Bill Clinton lose weight. And Dean Ornish also runs this wonderful and very large prevention research center that's associated with the University of California, San Francisco. And after Julia died, I actually was meeting with Dean, who's a good friend, and I decided to put him in the book because he said this to me and this is about a few months after I decided to write this book, and I was meeting with him in Sausalito, California. And he said, I have a good friend named Rachel. Basically, he first said, you have another daughter, don't you? And I said, yeah. Isn't her name Rachel? And I said, yes, her name is Rachel. And he said, I have a good friend named Rachel Raymond. And Rachel Raymond is a physician at the University of California, San Francisco, and she writes a lot about transcendence and thinking about purpose and meaning in your life. And she wrote this quote. She said, often finding meaning is not about doing things differently. It's about seeing familiar things in new ways. So what Dean Ornish was gently pointing out is that I have another daughter. I'm a teacher. I have students. I have a wife. I have a whole other set of things that I could develop a new purpose around. And I realized in my life that with one daughter being so sick, I'd spent so much time with that daughter, and I needed to devote much more of my time with my older daughter, with Rachel, and with my students. So part of my purpose is, first of all, to teach every one of my students as if they were my own daughters. That's part of my purpose. And the other is to spend much more time and quality time and effort and engagement with my wife and with our older daughter, Rachel. And our older daughter, Rachel, 3 weeks ago got married in our backyard.
Congratulations.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Both she and her new husband asked me to preside over the marriage and to marry them. And that was very fulfilling for me because it is part of my new purpose in life. And it didn't have to be going to India and feeding the poor. That's a wonderful purpose, by the way. It didn't have to go out and do something that completely changes your life. It'd be something that's right around you.
It's a wonderful example, and I love that notion that you attribute to Dean Ornish of seeing familiar things in new ways, just the stepping back. Fred Mandel, who I'm not sure if he's on this call or not, but he's somebody who I know you might have met him at the Positive Aging Conference. He has a book, I'm blocking the name of it right at the moment, but I'll think of it before we're done. But it's basically he focuses on artists and stepping back from the canvas and looking at things in different ways.
I remember Fred. He had all the painting. That was
exactly.
Yeah, I love that guy. What a great guy.
Yeah, I'm just for the moment blocking the name of it, but I'll have to look it up while we're talking. But what are you? There are two areas that seem so important is trying to help people who are approaching this next stage of life, who are leaving maybe what has been their purpose of work and the structure and the self-esteem, and trying to help people think in the way you're talking about that there's so much more ahead. Sounds like referring people to your book and to the app, but other suggestions of retirees or people who are thinking of retiring, of how to help them view this next stage of life with that positivity that you're talking about? One
of the interesting things Stoic philosophers did 2,000 years ago, I always think about Stoics being like Spock or Star, and they're Stoic, but also boring, frankly. They were some of the most interesting people. What they would do is plan a good life, and they'd also plan a good last chapter of their life, including their death. They thought a lot about how to go through, and this is related to hospice care, of course, and healthy death. How do you create these last chapters of your life in a way that really demonstrate that your life was meaningful, that you put a footprint, or as Steve Jobs said, put a ding in the universe? And I think what that actually means is planning. It means really carefully thinking about this and talking about it with your friends or your spouse, your loved ones, whoever you have in your life. I think it's an important thing to consider, to contemplate. So it may mean turning off the TV for a little bit and starting to just entertain different possibilities that you might have and explore. You might think that there's one that works really well for you and it doesn't work. I know I explored a couple of different avenues. It didn't work. But I went into kind of a rabbit hole that ended up taking me to a lot of places I never expected. And I think that I don't want to say this in any egocentric way, but I think I ended up coming out of that rabbit hole more resilient and a more whole person as a result of a tragic circumstance that we went through. And I think that retirees can do that. I certainly know many retirees who have started using our app and started finding purpose. And I get great letters from them about how they now have a greater direction in their life, and it's made their retirement more fulfilling. So I believe all of this is possible to do.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I'm wanting all our listeners to be able to take it in. Let me integrate a couple of comments that have come up so far, and then I'll have you go on once. The book by Fred Mandel and Kathy Jordan is called Becoming a Life Change Artist. So that was the name of the book that I couldn't remember. Somebody, thank you, posted it for me. And Elizabeth Craig from Minnesota just wanted to comment, Vic, about she was so glad that you talked about Yoda, because she says that her favorite quote from Yoda is, "Do or do not do. There is no try." And she said Yoda said this to Luke as he felt discouraged and was having a hard time raising his spaceship out of the mucky water. She says she uses this quote with her career transition clients all the time to get them to action. So she wants to thank you for mentioning Yoda.
That is so smart, by the way. You know what that is? Yeah. It reminds me of the Nike slogan, "Just do it."
Yeah.
That reminds me of behavior modification, where people who do behavior modification They say you can think about all the barriers you have in your life, but you know what? Just do it. And in being very committed, there's a new therapy, relatively new, called ACT, and it represents acceptance and commitment therapy. And the more they found that the more planful you become, the more you try to figure out all the barriers and how to solve the barriers of the problem you have or goals that you have, it's almost like swimming in quicksand. You tend to sink. They say, forget about the barriers. Become super committed to a purpose, super committed to a goal in your life, and just do it. Work toward that. And then the barriers will tend to take care of themselves. You'll figure out the barriers on your journey as you're doing something. I really do that philosophy, whether it comes to planning a new business in your life or helping take care of somebody that's difficult to take care of that person. Just doing it and then working through the barriers as you're doing it seems to make more sense now in modern psychological intervention.
Absolutely. I just want a couple of other things that come from the listeners. A comment by Alan, who said after a 30-year marriage, his wife just a week or two ago informed him that she wanted a divorce. And he said he's just so thankful that he had this opportunity to hear you, Vic, because he feels like this is really going to be so helpful for him. So I just wanted to, share that with you. But
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah. But as you say, sometimes we have to go deep into the rabbit hole, as you're saying, with all those deep, dark feelings to come out maybe in a better place.
Here's another book I'd recommend to him.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd recommend a book by Elizabeth Lesser, LDR, and it's called Broken Open. Broken Open was a book that really changed my life after my daughter died. And what she's referring to here in being broken open is that when tragic events occur, whether it's a loss of a loved one, getting very sick yourself, loss of a job, your ego actually breaks. Your ego is your defense mechanism, and it keeps you from seeing clearly very often. And when something really bad happens to you, this ego defense mechanism tends, at least for a period of time, break open. And it's really, what she says is that it's an opportunity to make serious, significant changes in your life. And for me, I was certainly broken open, and it enabled me to start thinking about my own profession, how I approach change differently, and how I try to help people very differently. And I certainly hope it helps this gentleman.
Thank you. I know that book too, and it's excellent, so I second that. A question from Bill from Houston. He said that you had mentioned a website that he said was youngville.org. I'm not sure.
No, it's actually Dung Beetle.
Yeah, that's why I thought it was your own that you were saying, but I just wanted to be sure.
Youngbeetle.org. So that's B as in David, UNGBEETLE.org.
What I will do is make sure when the recording goes out that we put that down too.
That's wonderful. There's a whole backstory that's in there. There's some videos in there.
Yeah.
You can meet Winston the Dung Beetle, and you can you can use the app online just with your computer every day if you want, or you may want to use it every once in a while.
I have another question. Bruce Branco and I had been in contact before. I'm not sure if he's on the call or not, but there were a couple of things he raised that I would like to integrate into some questions I asked you. And just one of the questions is, we all know, or many of us know, and you underscore now with the science, and many of the people on the call who happen to be coaches or therapists, I think truly buy in and understand this importance of purpose. But we live in this culture, and I know you talk about it a bit in the book too, where people are the media and wealth and things and materialism and all those things seem to take over. So what ideas do you have on how to help both the retirees, but also the younger generation, or maybe people who are in the grandparent role, try to help people recognize the importance of this and to see through the sham?
To be honest, one of the reasons I wrote the book as a graphic novel was that I did want to appeal to younger people. And one of the big groups who are using this are, of course, retirees. But also another group, oddly enough, are young people, high school students, even junior high students. I've had readers as young as 9 years old write to me, and college students certainly. And so I think that these are really important groups, because what they're facing now on television are these reality shows. So what are the Kardashian sisters doing? Why do I care what the Kardashian sisters are doing? Why do I care whether Miley Cyrus has a new twerking video? Why do I care what twerking means in the first place? I really don't care. about that. And yet the world seems to care more and more about these inane things. Nietzsche talked about this. Friedrich Nietzsche said, as we modernize, we'll start losing our purpose and we'll start focusing our attention on inane, stupid things. Emile Durkheim, who followed him, he was the world's first sociologist. He's a French sociologist. He wrote a book in 1888 called Suicide. And he said, as we start losing meaning and purpose in our lives, we'll start losing our connections that we have in our life, and we'll start committing suicide more. And sure enough, when you look right now, 2014, at the countries that have the lowest levels of purpose or meaning in their lives, and very often this does relate to religion. Religion gives a meaning in our lives, but as we lose that religion, we start killing ourselves. We have higher suicide rates, higher depression rates. And I'm not necessarily saying that you should become religious. And I'm sure that many people listening to this are very deeply religious, but also many people are not. And the question is, can you be non-religious in terms of having an organized religious faith and still have a purpose in your life? And that's one of the things my book tackled. And I strongly believe that you can indeed have a purpose in your life. Nietzsche talked about that, and Emile Durkheim talked about that. Existentialist philosophers, some, like Soren Kierkegaard, were very religious. Others were not religious. They were atheists. Jean-Paul Sartre or Simone de Beauvoir. Everybody though said you need to have a purpose, direction, meaning in your life. And if you don't have a religion that helps define that, you need to find it for yourself.
So I have a question related to that, also influenced by a conversation, email conversation actually, with Bruce Frankel. For so long, purpose was thinking about what you were just saying. It was God's purpose for us. Or,
that's right.
There's a purpose under heaven. Right. And so do you think part of the issue is people really recognizing it's up to them? There can be a God, and you can believe in God, but that you really need to figure out for yourself? Or what?
I think whether you're religious or not, you do have to determine what your personal purpose is. And that could be in reference to some values that nearly every single religion suggests. And there may be evolutionary reasons. In fact, many evolutionary biologists talk about how even when we're on the savannah 40,000, 100,000 years ago, there were certain very positive values. If those were held, then our gene pool would be promoted. I'll give you an example. If you're on the savannah and you have this little village of 100 people and you're all cavemen and suddenly a saber-toothed tiger comes in, one of the mothers may say, you children, you run. I'll take care of this saber-toothed tiger. Of course, that woman will get killed by the saber-toothed tiger, but her gene pool will be extended by her children. So that self-transcending purpose, thinking about something bigger than herself, created an extension of her gene pool. So this absolutely can fit with both evolutionary theory, but it also fits with nearly every single religion. But I believe deep down, we do have to come up with our own purpose.
I think what you're saying makes so much sense. Do you think purpose is culturally determined in a way? Do you find differences? We're mentioning.
Good question.
Yeah. What? Yeah.
Well, there have been studies looking at different populations within the U.S. For example, different, like in African American culture versus a Caucasian culture or others. And they found, for example, that an American has a culture have very deep purpose in many people's lives. There's certain groups within African American cultures who have deeper purposes. And you can study this a lot and find that there's certain populations that basically they're brought up with a stronger purpose in their life. I think about African American women who tend to be very natural caregivers to their parents. And they're brought up that way. And they'll say that. If I didn't even think about myself as a caregiver, this is part of being a human being for me. And that's very culturally developed. And so I'm sure there are certainly cultures that have more meaning and purpose in their lives. I was in India recently, and part of Hinduism is, especially what's called Vedantic Hindu philosophy, very connected with having a strong purpose or meaning in one's life. So yes, I'm sure this is different with different cultures. So a visiting professor, I think you mentioned this at King University.
Yeah.
And many of the students there that I've taught come up and say, we've never had a purpose in our lives. Our parents did when Mao Zedong was alive, and everybody had the same purpose. And That's not a very good purpose to have, one might argue. But now we're left without any purpose. So we are more depressed. We have higher suicide rates. We need a meaning or purpose in our lives. But in modern China, we don't have that as much.
That is interesting. And I remember reading in your book that in Japan, it's one of the highest suicide rates of
Yes,
young
they have the
people.
highest suicide rate of any G8 country, of any developed country, and yet they have the highest life expectancy. And this isn't me saying this. Actually, there are philosophers and scientists in Japan who have written about this and said, wow, this is a big problem that we have. We need to control this because we're so successful in helping people live longer. Who cares if you're not living a meaningful life?
Wow. I want to integrate two other comments that some listeners have brought in. One is Meg from Weston, and she said she wanted to mention Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who you had quoted a little bit earlier, Vic. Yeah. And she said her 3 questions that people universally ask on their deathbeds. One is, have I given and received love? Have I lived my life and not someone else's? And have I left the world a little better than I found it? And she says, and I do agree too, all are related to transcending purpose. Also, she wants to recommend Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi's book, From Aging to Saging, which has a couple of important pieces of inner work when people are facing mortality, leaving a legacy, mentoring, and that's a lovely book too. I recommend that to people. And then Larry from West Virginia says that his 90-year-old grandmother gave him advice several years ago. It was, don't do it tomorrow, do it today. And he says, I think that goes along with Vic's guidance of just do it, or Yoda would say.
Yeah. Thank you to both of you. Those are wonderful. It reminds me of the saying, don't be the richest person in the cemetery. If you do have a legacy to provide, if you do have accumulated some degree of wealth, I love what many people from Andrew Carnegie to Warren Buffett have said, which is, I don't want to die as the richest person in the cemetery. I want to make sure that I'm giving my wealth away to things that are important. Great.
Yeah. And Karen from Minneapolis says that her recent joy in life is a 6-year-old great-granddaughter named Trinity who visits overnight. And she said in a discussion about a book about a grandma dying, she said, I don't want to talk about dying because then I'd have to say goodbye to my mama and daddy. And she said she was just stunned at her awareness of 6-year-old of just life and death.
My goodness. These are wonderful comments.
Yeah. What else? Any other? I know we're a little past 1, and you said you'd give us just a few more minutes. So I'll just for the audience, takeaways of, you've mentioned so much, and I do want to underscore both your book and the apps and the website. One, Elizabeth actually from Minnesota said that she's used your website a lot and she loves it.
Oh, really? Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you.
But other thoughts about purpose? I think you've talked about purpose and finding it and in our depth so that we can find more meaning in the present. I just wonder if there are just thoughts of what, as we are approaching the second half of life, other thoughts for either ourselves or helping other people who seem not so geared to it.
One thing I wouldn't mind thinking about a bit more and discussing is how it's a quote that I think a few thousand years ago said, when a man does not know what harbor he is making for, no wind is the right wind. What that means is we all need vitality, energy to be able to work toward a purpose. And if we have a really transcending purpose, we have to start thinking about what gives us more energy. If we have no purpose, as Seneca said, no wind is the right wind, no energy is the right energy. You have to have that harbor. That's important. But one of the things that my app collects and monitors and helps you with are 5 different behaviors that you might think about. One is sleep. We simply don't get enough sleep in this country, and we know that seniors have a more difficult time getting enough sleep and suffer from sleep disturbances. By the way, we know that having a strong purpose in life gives you protection from sleep disturbances. We have data on this from 22,000 people in what's called the National Health and Retirement Survey, and we just found this. We haven't published it yet, but it's going to come out. So sleep is very important, and if you just go online, you can find ways to sleep better. There are definitely ways to get better sleep. The second is presence or mindfulness. Meditation is important. If you're religious, prayer is very important. For some people, golf is a way to become more present. Cooking, gardening. There are a lot of ways of becoming here and now, very present, where you're not thinking about the present. You're not thinking about the future, and you're not thinking about the past. You're not mulling over all of these thoughts. You're very present with what you're doing. The third is activity, physical activity. Fourth is being more creative. They've found people who are more creative and even giving people activities to become more creative, they become more energetic. They have more vitality. And then finally, eating. We know that eating what they call a Mediterranean diet, following a Mediterranean diet, seems to give you more energy and vitality. And they found this in what are called randomized trials, where half the people are randomized to not getting a Mediterranean diet. Half the people are given this Mediterranean diet. And you can go online and look at what Mediterranean diet means. Basically means eating a little less red meat, more chicken and fish, bread to some extent, just more vegetables, things like that, nuts. So this adds up to S for sleep, P for presence, A for activity, C for creativity, and E for eating, and it spells space. So in my half, I asked the person, did you get space in your life? And you get to rate how well every day you slept, how present, how active, how creative, and how well you're eating. And then if you take the app for 10 days, it has enough data then to say, oh, for you, Joe, your present or your activity or your creativity is most related to how you align your day, how you've been living your day according to purpose or not according to your purpose. So, as Seneca said, no wind is the right wind if you don't have a harbor. At the same time, if you do have a harbor, you need the wind. You need the energy in that sail to move toward that harbor. And space can give that to you.
Oh, I love that. That's really great.
Each of those, by the way, have been shown in scientific studies to give you more vitality and energy. They also give you more self-control to help you in quitting smoking, to managing your drinking more, to manage, let's say you're taking too many prescription drugs, could help you manage that. So these base behaviors, I think, are absolutely central to having more energy, vitality, and self-control.
Excellent. And I think it relates, there's a couple more question and comment. I think it relates to this one, but I just want to ask it anyway, since Mary from California. Can you talk about anything you've learned about the need for developing meaning for single people or people with little or no family? And I think this, what you just talked about, is somehow very much related, but I wondered if you had some other thoughts when, I guess it's when the connection and purpose isn't going to necessarily be there.
Yeah, and let me start by saying this. We know that having connections with other people is important in your life. That does not necessarily mean connection through marriage. It can mean connection through having friends, colleagues, and you can inject yourself into social networks, inject yourself into groups, new organizations. And I would suggest that's a very important thing to do if you can. And you can find and develop meaning and purpose in that. People can't or who are unable to find those kind of connections, I believe they still find meaning and purpose through giving. You don't have to give to friends or family. You could give to people who you've never met before. I have a good friend. His name is Graham Kerr. He was the Galloping Gourmet. You might remember him in the 1960s and 70s. Only he and Julia Child had cooking shows. And there is a website that Graham Kerr developed called Outdulgent. Rather than indulgence, where you're thinking about doing things for yourself, he said, think about outdulgent. Think about if you were to eat less red meat, how much money you might save. And he literally does this with his wife, Trina. He uses the money that he saves and he sends it to this African school in Africa to help cover the tuition of kids in Africa. That to me is very self-transcending. You're not thinking about your own indulgence, but you're thinking about outdulgence, something bigger than yourself.
What a good term, outdulgence.
Yeah, I loved it. He's just a creative guy.
Two real quick other comments, and then I'm going to do the final closing it. But Elizabeth has said that a number of people have said this is phenomenal. Thank you so much. And she said that it reminded her that Seneca, that her high school class graduation in 1969, it was make haste to live and consider each day a life. I think that's really
Isn't that relevant?
That's really very relevant. And someone else who didn't say who they were, but I happen to know this work also, and I think it's really helpful, is John Kabat-Zinn's work on mindfulness, stress reduction. I actually did some training in a program that was his, and I think this mindfulness, and I think you spoke to that too, or just how important that is. And also just to give, if I didn't say the whole title of Fred's book before it, Becoming a Life Change Artist, 7 Creative Skills to Reinvent Yourself at Any Stage of Life. And that's Fred Mandel and Kathy Jordan that I mentioned before. I appreciate a number of people sent me emails with their full title, so I want to thank you for that. Any just last, there are no more questions or comments, and there have been many comments from people just saying just how phenomenal this has been and how helpful, and thank you so much. And I want to thank you too. I could listen to you go on and on.
You did go on and on.
Yeah.
That's all right. And I certainly hope everybody got something from it.
Oh, I think that everybody did, and I thank you so much. And I think it's such a gift that you've given everybody to both share the wealth of learning from the depths of your tragedy, but the way you've integrated philosophy and literature and science. And I do encourage people to read the book because it's wonderful, and will get, I think, many of you interested maybe in different areas of learning. I know it has for me.
I'd also like to say, if anybody is interested, and if you have had some success in finding purpose as a result of this and are going through any positive life change, I'd love to hear from you. And actually, at my email address, which is Strecher, STRECHERUMICA.edu.
Thank you so much, Vic. I really am so appreciative of your spending this time with us.
Thank you, Dory. It was truly my pleasure.
Thanks. And thanks everybody for being here. Take care.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.